A slow mist curls over the wide, brown Ohio River, shrouding the small clapboard house at Point Pleasant in the damp chill of an April dawn in 1822. Inside, the cry of a newborn pierces the quiet. The infant, soon named Hiram Ulysses Grant, enters a world of tanning vats and harness leather, his father Jesse a restless, cell-made tanner, and his mother Hannah a woman of few words and deep, steady faith. From these modest, unscented beginnings, no one could have guessed that this child would one day command vast armies and reshape a fractured nation. The Ohio of his boyhood was a landscape of hard labor, axe-cut clearings, river-borne commerce, and a horizon that promised both opportunity and obscurity. Young Ulysses, as he came to be known, displayed no prodigious gifts. He was quiet, patient with horses, and utterly repelled by the slaughterhouse reek of the tannery. He preferred the rhythm of the river and the steady plod of a draft horse to the clamor of ambition. At 17, resentful and reluctant, he entered the United States Military Academy at West Point, a place his father had arranged without his consent. The gray stone barracks, perched above the silver ribbon of the Hudson River, felt more prison than opportunity. He was shy, homesick, and utterly average in everything except mathematics and horsemanship. Yet the cadet who slept in a narrow cot inside those cold walls absorbed a quiet discipline. He learned to read terrain, to calculate supply trains, and to endure the monotony of routine without complaint. Graduating 21st in a class of 39, he hoped for a short career in the cavalry before a teaching post. Instead, destiny assigned him to the infantry and, soon after, to the crucible of war. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 swept Lieutenant Grant across the Rio Grande and deep into the sun-scorched valleys of northern Mexico. As a regimental quartermaster, he was responsible for mule trains, wagons loaded with hardtack and ammunition, and the relentless, unglamorous logistics of an invading army. He watched General Zachary Taylor and then General Winfield Scott fight brilliant campaigns, studying how armies moved, how supplies won battles, and how morale rested on a commander's steady presence. He witnessed the storming of Molino del Rey and the fall of Mexico City, always in the thick of the supply lines that kept the columns advancing. The young officer performed with quiet competence, learning the terrible arithmetic of war and the cost of unpreparedness. The chaparral, the adobe missions, the dust-covered columns of men, all burned into his memory, shaping a philosophy of aggressive logistics that would later become his hallmark. After the war, separated from his beloved wife Julia and their young children, Grant entered a long, bleached season of peacetime isolation. Posted to remote barracks on the Pacific coast, far from family and with too much idle time, loneliness gnawed at his spirit. He resigned from the army in 1854, returning to Missouri with little more than a few coins and heavy ambitions to provide. What followed was a 7-year slide through disappointment that would have broken a lesser soul. He tried to farm on a patch of land near St. Louis, a place he wryly called Hardscrabble, a rough-hewn log cabin where he cut wood, hauled water, and watched crops fail in unforgiving soil. He sold firewood on street corners, his blue army overcoat growing threadbare as townspeople passed him by without a second glance. When the farm finally failed, he tried bill collecting, then real estate, each venture crumbling into dust. He worked in a custom house office, and then, humbling himself completely, he joined his father's leather goods business in Galena, Illinois, as a lowly clerk. The modest brick storefront on Main Street became a symbol of his reduced fortunes. At 40 years old, he was a man who had tasted the glory of a victorious army and now sat on a high stool balancing ledgers, invisible and dismissed. Yet this painful period, which his enemies later misconstrued as proof of innate failure, was in fact an essential forge. He never complained, never blamed others. He simply kept working and refused to surrender to despair. The man who couldn't sell a cord of wood would soon demonstrate a terrifying capacity for endurance. The important limitation of this season is plain. Grant lacked the commercial instinct, the sharp-edged ambition, and perhaps the ruthless self-promotion that peacetime capitalism demanded. He was too trusting, too willing to extend credit, and too quiet to charm investors. His civilian failures, however, were not moral failures. They taught him humility, a profound empathy for ordinary, struggling people, and an unshakable inner calm under pressure. In the cramped quarters of hardscrabble, chopping wood as sleet rattled the windows, he forged the tempo of his future command, unhurried, deliberate, immune to panic. When the nation finally called him again, he would bring with him not the polish of a drawing-room general, but the calloused hands and steady heart of a man who had already lost so much that he no longer feared the sting of temporary defeat. A cold drizzle hung over the muddy streets of Galena, Illinois, in April 1861, staining the red brick storefronts and plastering fallen leaves to the boardwalks. Inside his father's leather goods shop, a 40-year-old clerk with stooped shoulders and a faded civilian coat heard the news. Fort Sumter had fallen, and the nation was at war with itself. Ulysses Grant set down his pen, closed the ledger, and walked to the town meeting hall. There was no grand speech, no theatrical gesture, just a quiet, unassuming man volunteering to train a company of raw volunteers. Within weeks, the failed farmer and forgotten ex-captain put on a blue uniform again, his quiet competence sparking a transformation that even he could not have fully imagined. The riverfront warehouses and steamboat landings of Galena faded behind him. Ahead lay the Mississippi Valley, and a destiny larger than any promotion. Grant's return to active command was initially a story of organizational chaos and political indifference. Promoted to colonel and then brigadier general of volunteers, he was entrusted with the defense of critical waterways. In early February 1862, aided by the gunboat fleet of Flag Officer Andrew Foote, he launched a daring combined operation against Fort Henry on the rain-swollen Tennessee River. Torrential winter rains had flooded the approaches, leaving the low-lying Confederate fort partially submerged, its defenders wading in icy water. Grant disembarked his men through thick mud and marched overland, only to find the fort already abandoned after the Union gunboats' bombardment. Without pausing, he seized the initiative and turned toward the far stronger Fort Donelson, 12 miles away on the Cumberland River. The siege of Fort Donelson in the bitter cold of mid-February cracked open the west. Confederate cavalry under Nathan Bedford Forrest escaped, but the infantry and artillery were trapped inside a circle of Union entrenchments. When the Confederate commander asked Grant for terms of surrender, his reply echoed across a nation starved for victory. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. The fort fell, sending some 15,000 rebel soldiers into captivity and delivering the Union its first major strategic triumph of the war. Newspapers gleefully printed the name, Unconditional Surrender, Grant, and President Lincoln, with a father's relief, promoted him to Major General of Volunteers. The quiet clerk from Galena had demonstrated a quality all the more precious for its rarity, the refusal to equivocate in the decisive moment. An important limitation soon revealed itself, however, in the chill pre-dawn hours of April 6, 1862, at a nondescript church called Shiloh. Grant had concentrated his Army of the Tennessee near Pittsburg Landing, intending to attack Confederate rail junctions at Corinth, Mississippi, but he underestimated his opponent's audacity. General Albert Sidney Johnston launched a massive surprise assault, gray waves of infantry crashing through the woods and overrunning Union camps, while men boiled coffee or pulled on their boots. Grant, recovering from a horse fall days earlier and limping painfully, arrived from his headquarters downriver to find his army driven back nearly 2 miles, a chaotic mass of routed regiments cowering against the bank of the Tennessee River. The scene was one of sheer horror. A driving rain, dying screams, and the grim specter of complete ruin. Yet Grant did not panic. Amid the shattered lines, he calmly observed, "They can't break this line. Butler's division will hold," and began reorganizing a defensive perimeter anchored by massed artillery. Through the long, wet night, while a cold rain soaked the living and the dead, Grant stood by a campfire under a sheltering oak, his battered hat pulled low. General William Tecumseh Sherman found him there, ready to discuss retreat, but instead heard words of unyielding resolve. "Well, Grant, "We've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" "Yes," Grant replied, chewing the end of a cigar. "Lick 'em tomorrow, though." At first light, reinforced by Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio, Grant ordered a counterattack. The Union line surged forward, reclaiming the blood-soaked fields, the peach orchard in full pink bloom now littered with the fallen. By afternoon, the exhausted Confederates were in full retreat, leaving behind a battlefield that shocked the nation with its scale of carnage, more American casualties in 2 days than in all previous wars combined. Shiloh was a brutal, costly lesson, yet it proved a strategic necessity. It shattered the Confederate offensive in the West and paved the road into the Mississippi heartland. Grant learned profoundly from the near disaster. He absorbed the importance of entrenchment, the need for constant reconnaissance, and above all, the realization that the war would be won not by a single brilliant stroke, but by grinding, unrelenting pressure. His willingness to bear the weight of shocking losses, to absorb the initial blow without breaking, and to counterattack with methodical fury set him apart. The nation had found not a flawless commander, but a profoundly resilient one, a man who, when knocked into the mud, rose to his feet, straightened his coat, and advanced. The Mississippi River in the spring of 1863 lay wide and brown under a hazy sky, its muddy current coiling past cypress swamps and cotton fields silvered with early morning mist. Along the Yazoo Delta, paddle steamers churned slowly, their wheels slapping the water with a heavy, rhythmic sigh that mingled with the cry of distant gulls. Here, in the heart of the Confederacy, the Great Waterway remained a stubborn artery of Southern trade, and Grant knew that if he could sever it at Vicksburg, the rebellion would bleed from a mortal wound. The city of Vicksburg sat on high bluffs, its batteries commanding a sweeping bend where every Union vessel became a target. Grant, after weeks of frustrated bayou expeditions, made an audacious decision. He would march his army down the west bank, run the ironclad gunboats past the night-guarded guns, then cross below. On a moonless April night, citizens of Vicksburg woke to the silhouette of warships sliding through drifts of powder smoke, their engines muffled, the river's surface flickering with orange torches. When the fleet survived, Grant had his opening. What followed was a campaign that military textbooks would later call a masterpiece of maneuver. Grant cut his own supply line, cutting the telegraph and vanishing into the piney woods of Mississippi. His soldiers marched light, hauling ammunition on mule-drawn wagons, foraging from barns and smokehouses as they swept inland. Dust rose in ochre clouds along narrow farm lanes. Men slept in pastures beneath stars that the humid southern nights made soft and low. In 17 days they fought and won 5 battles, slipping around Confederate forces, never giving them time to breathe. By late May, Grant's army had pinned the Confederate defenders inside Vicksburg's earthworks and dug in for a siege. Day after day, the lemon-colored sun baked the ravines where civilians, unable to flee, burrowed into the clay hillsides to escape Union shelling. They carved out dark rooms lit by smoky tallow candles, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and stale cornmeal. Grant's soldiers, entrenched on a broad ridge of high ground, could hear the town's church bells still ringing until the bronze was melted for bullets. The river below held blockading warships, sealing every escape. On the morning of July 4, 1863, a white flag fluttered above the Confederate trenches. The siege had lasted 47 days, and inside the city, men were gaunt, horses had been eaten, and the last mule meat was gone. Grant rode forward on a dusty bay horse, past lines of silent rebel soldiers who stacked their arms without ceremony. He offered no humiliation, simply paroling the garrison and ordering thousands of army rations to be issued to the starving Confederates. As federal troops marched in, the stars and stripes rose over the courthouse, and the Mississippi River, now fully in Union control, shimmered like a sheet of hammered silver from St. Louis to the Gulf. That autumn, the war's center shifted east to the shadow of Lookout Mountain, where a different kind of suffering awaited. The Union Army at Chattanooga was bottled up, starving, reduced to quarter rations of hardtack and mule meat, while frost crept into their thin tents. In late October, Grant arrived, noted the soldiers' hollow faces, and seized a daring plan: Troops would float downriver at night on pontoon boats, seize Brown's Ferry, and open a short supply route they soon called the Cracker Line. Within days, sacks of flour and coffee were winding into the valley, and the men's spirits lifted. The finale unfolded in late November, when a thick fog cloaked the slopes of Lookout Mountain like a gray wool blanket. Union soldiers ascended through cold, wet cloud, their silhouettes ghostly against the autumn hardwood. By noon they stood atop the craggy summit, watching the fog burn off to reveal the Tennessee Valley bathed in pale sunlight. 2 days later, at Missionary Ridge, a charge that began as a limited demonstration turned into a spontaneous, irresistible surge up the steep slope. Soldiery swept over the earthworks with a roar loud enough to shake winter-bare trees. The siege was broken, and the deep South lay open. In these twin campaigns, Grant demonstrated a quality of mind that saw landscape not as obstacle but as opportunity. His willingness to break free of conventional supply lines, to move fast, and to trust his subordinates revealed a commander who learned as he went. Yet the siege of Vicksburg also showed the heavy cost modern war exacts on civilians, a lesson that would only darken in the coming year. That quiet man from Ohio, still so often underestimated, had cleaved the Confederacy in two and turned the war's tide toward a hard, lasting peace. In the spring of 1864, the thickets of northern Virginia exploded into a tangled second growth where sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor. This was the wilderness, a forbidding maze of scrub oak, pine, and thorny underbrush, where streams ran dark and the air hung heavy with the scent of damp leaves. Here, on the 5th of May, Grant began his first campaign as General-in-Chief, determined to pin Robert E. Lee's army and never let go. The sudden crackle of musketry would soon shatter the stillness, but before the first shot, a wood thrush still called from a copse of dogwood in bloom. Unlike his predecessors, who retreated back across the Rapidan after similar horrors, Grant refused to go backward. After 2 days of blind fighting in the burning woods, where wounded men lay trapped in flames, he ordered the Army of the Potomac not to turn north, but to press south towards Spotsylvania Courthouse. In the pre-dawn hours, as exhausted soldiers filed down a muddy road, they saw Grant's silhouette on horseback at a crossroads, pointing not to safety, but deeper into Virginia. A ragged cheer went up, for these men understood that something had changed. The weeks that followed became a grinding dance of flank and counterflank. Soldiers slept in shallow rifle pits, listening to the constant dripping of rain from oak leaves, chewing hardtack while watching smoke curl from distant farmhouses. At Spotsylvania's bloody angle, men grappled hand-to-hand for 20 hours in the rain, the mud absorbing the sound. At Cold Harbor, Grant ordered one final assault that he would later regret, but even then, he did not retreat. Instead, he pivoted southeast, sidling toward the James River with the same quiet patience of a farmer circling a stubborn mule. In mid-June, the army vanished from Lee's front entirely, slipping away under cover of darkness. Union engineers threw a pontoon bridge 2,000 feet long across the broad James River, a marvel of teak-brown planks and canvas-covered pontoons that bobbed gently with the tide. Soldiers crossed through a golden summer dusk, the water reflecting copper and lavender, while bands played and the regimental flags snapped in the warm breeze. Lee was utterly deceived, and when Grant appeared at Petersburg, the last railroad hub feeding Richmond, the siege that would decide the war had begun. For 9 months, the armies stared at each other from parallel ribbons of earth that stretched for miles across the Virginia countryside. Life inside those trenches assumed a strange rhythm, men reading dog-eared letters by candlelight, brewing coffee in dented tin cups, listening to the distant thud of mortars. African-American troops of the United States Colored Troops manned sections of the line, their presence a quiet testament to the war's evolving purpose. The summer heat gave way to autumn's carpet of scarlet and gold, and then to a freezing winter when snow dusted the abatis and the men's breath hung like little ghosts. At dawn on April 2, 1865, after months of sapping and mining, a Federal assault finally broke through the thinning Confederate trenches southwest of Petersburg. The blue tide poured into the gap, and that evening Lee's army abandoned both Petersburg and Richmond. The Confederate capital, its warehouse district set ablaze by evacuating troops, cast an orange glow against the night sky as federal forces moved in to extinguish the fires. Grant pressed the pursuit westward through rolling farmland, the new grass soft underfoot, sending cavalry to cut off the last avenues of escape. On the morning of April 9th, outside the tiny village of Appomattox Courthouse, a silence settled over the fields. Lee, in a spotless gray uniform with a red sash, waited in the parlor of the McLean house, while Grant, traveling hard and wearing a private's coat mud-spattered from the road, arrived late. The two commanders sat at a small marble-topped table. Grant's chief of staff, Ely Parker, a Seneca chief, stood nearby as documents were signed. Grant's terms were so gentle, allowing officers to keep their sidearms and soldiers to take home their horses for the spring planting, that Lee remarked the kindness would do much toward reconciliation. Grant's Overland campaign remains a subject of intense historical debate. The butchering tally, nearly 65,000 Union casualties in 7 weeks, shocked the Northern public, and the butcher label clung to him. But Grant understood, as few others did, that the war could be ended only by destroying Lee's army, and that the longer the conflict dragged on, the more lives it would ultimately consume. His refusal to retreat, his ability to absorb terrible blows and keep moving, transformed a stalemated war into an inexorable march. At Appomattox, that same tenacity allowed him to be magnanimous, and in that magnanimity, the first fragile bricks of reunion were laid. The gas lamps of Washington flickered softly against the polished marble of the Capitol's eastern facade as evening settled over a nation still nursing its deepest wounds. In the spring of 1869, Ulysses S. Grant took the presidential oath with a characteristically quiet resolve, his uniform traded for a civilian coat and his gaze fixed on a fractured country. The streets around the White House still bore the dust of war, and in the quiet of his new office, the sound of carpenters hammering fresh planks into damaged boarding houses echoed a people's tentative hope. Grant's own workroom, just down the hall from the family's private quarters, was unadorned except for a few battlefield maps and a worn leather chair in which he began each morning with a cigar and a stack of congressional reports. In those early months, Grant turned his dogged attention to the brutal backlash threatening to erase the Union's hard-won victory. Across the southern states, night riders in white hoods were burning schoolhouses and dragging black citizens from their homes in a campaign of terror. For Grant, the moral imperative was clear. The promise of emancipation had to mean more than ink on paper. He pushed Congress to ratify the 15th Amendment, which declared that the right to vote could not be denied on account of race, and when it was finally enshrined in 1870, he called it the most important event since the birth of the nation. The president's own handwriting, deliberate and unhurried, covered the proclamation calling upon all Americans to accept this new constitutional truth. Yet laws alone could not halt the lash and the torch. Grant understood that freedom required enforcement, and so he put his full weight behind a suite of measures known as the Enforcement Acts, the first of which he signed in the spring of 1870. The legislation made it a federal crime to interfere with voting rights through intimidation or violence, and it gave the president the authority to use the army to protect civilians. Shortly afterward, Grant oversaw the creation of a dedicated legal instrument, the Department of Justice, established to give teeth to the new laws. In the department's modest offices, clerks by gaslight began sorting through affidavits from terrified sharecroppers, slowly assembling the paper trail of an invisible empire. The true test came in South Carolina, where the Ku Klux Klan had all but overthrown local government through murder and floggings. Grant responded with a swift and unwavering hand. In the autumn of 1871, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus in 9 upcountry counties, authorizing federal troops and newly appointed district attorneys to round up hundreds of Klansmen. The sound of heavy boots on wooden boardwalks replaced the furtive gallop of night riders as mass arrests swept through Yorkville and Spartanburg. Trials followed in which federal grand juries, shielded from local intimidation, heard detailed testimony that peeled away the hoods and exposed the ordinary men beneath, former Confederate officers, planters, and small farmers alike. By year's end, the Klan's backbone was broken, and Grant had demonstrated that the federal government would not stand idle while its citizens were terrorized. As his first term drew to a close, Grant could look back on a string of accomplishments that had given Reconstruction its most hopeful hour. Black men cast ballots, served on juries, and even took their seats in Congress under the shield of federal law. Yet the steady unfolding of that work was soon shadowed by events far from the cotton fields and courthouses. In the marbled corridors of Washington, the quiet integrity that defined Grant's private conduct began to collide with the appetite of associates who sought profit from proximity to power. The president, trusting in friends as he had trusted his wartime staff, found himself surrounded by men far less honorable. The second term bore the weight of those misplaced loyalties. The whiskey ring scandal, uncovered in 1875, revealed that a network of distillers and revenue officials had siphoned millions of dollars in tax revenue, and the trail led uncomfortably close to the White House. Grant, hearing the news in his study while the afternoon light caught tobacco smoke in slow swirls, ordered the malefactors prosecuted without mercy, famously instructing, "Let no guilty man escape." When his own personal secretary was implicated, the blow was deeply personal, and the president's health suffered under the strain. Yet, while Grant himself remained untouched by personal corruption, the repeated revelations, credit mobilier, the Indian agency rings, the belated discovery of scheming among cabinet officers stained the administration in the public eye. The atmosphere of the last years in office became overcast, the earlier moral clarity blurred by a weariness that even Grant's stubbornness could not lift. The nation's attention drifted away from the plight of the freed people and toward economic uncertainty and political fatigue. Still, the president continued to work at his desk into the quiet evening hours, reading dispatches and signing orders with a firm hand. When he left the White House in the spring of 1877, the carpets were worn thin by years of pacing, and the walls held the quiet echoes of a man who had tried, imperfectly but with deep conviction, to make the peace as lasting as the war. The morning light came slanting through the tall windows of a quiet cottage on the slopes of Mount McGregor, high above the Hudson Valley, where the scent of pine drifted across a narrow porch. Inside, wrapped in a woolen shawl despite the summer warmth, Ulysses S. Grant sat in a cane-backed chair pulled close to a small writing table. Each breath brought a sharp, searing pain from the cancer that was slowly closing his throat, and he could no longer speak above a raspy whisper. Yet his pen moved steadily, the nib scratching against the paper as he added line after line to a manuscript that would become his final campaign. Only a year earlier, Grant had been a man of comfortable reputation but shattered finances. A trusted business partner named Ferdinand Ward had proven to be a swindler of the first order, and the firm's collapse swept away virtually everything the former president owned. Reduced to poverty, Grant was forced to sell war mementos and even his own sword to buy his wife's groceries. When creditors closed in, he refused to declare bankruptcy, insisting on repaying every dollar. It was then, with his health already failing, that he turned to the only asset left to him, his own story. Encouraged by friends and drawn by an offer from Mark Twain, who promised him an unprecedented royalty share, Grant began writing down the memories of a lifetime spent in the service of his country. The workroom on Mount McGregor became a sanctuary of quiet labor. Julia, his wife of nearly 40 years, would bring glasses of cool lemonade and sit reading beside him as he filled page after page. The bookshelves in the corner held no volumes of strategy, only a well-worn Bible and a few framed photographs of his children. The slow rhythm of the seasons outside the window marked the passage of time as summer slid into a gentle autumn. Through the gathering pain, Grant wrote with astonishing clarity and modesty, describing the Mexican-American battlefields under a blistering sun, the muddy trenches of Vicksburg, the tense stillness of the McLean parlor at Appomattox. He avoided self-praise and admitted his own mistakes with the unflinching honesty of a soldier. The chapters grew, 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 words, each one written in a firm, steady hand that seemed to defy the physical wasting of his body. His doctors marveled that he could still work at all, yet Grant pressed on, determined to finish before the final silence. In the early days of July 1885, the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant were at last completed, the final page of manuscript set down just days before he could no longer lift the pen. He had done what he set out to do, secure his family's financial future and leave behind a testament that would endure. When the end came on a humid July morning, the cottage fell quiet, and the letter from his publisher arrived too late to read, bearing news that the coming commercial success would be unlike anything the literary world had seen. The funeral procession in New York City was a spectacle of quiet grandeur. As the horse-drawn catafalque carried his casket through streets lined with weeping citizens, the procession stretched for miles, Union and Confederate veterans marching alongside one another in a tribute to a man who had treated the defeated with dignity. The crowd stood in a hush, the only sounds the shuffle of boots and the slow cadence of muffled drums. The pallbearers included both former generals and old comrades from a hard youth, all bearing witness to a life that had refused to yield. In the years that followed, the memoir became an American classic, read in lamplight by those who had never known the war and praised by literary critics for its directness and grace. Grant's tomb rose on the edge of the Hudson, a great domed structure of granite and marble where visitors leave small tokens, a coin, a medal, a handwritten note, in memory of the quiet man entombed within. His legacy, like the last lines of his book, is one of perseverance in the face of despair, a stubborn belief that even the deepest hardships can be met with unassuming courage and that surrender, no matter how tempting, is never truly an option.